Alright everybody, thanks for joining me. Today we're going to go through numerical and algebraic expressions. These examples are pretty challenging. We've got several different things we have to take into consideration here, and so let's get right to it. Let's start with the words. Let's take these words, let's change them into algebraic expressions. So we start with the quotient of x and y. So quotient, whenever you see the word quotient, that means we're talking about division. So you could just pretty much do it in order, the way that it's meant to be here. It's not that big of a deal. You can just say the quotient of x and y is going to be x. I always like making it red here, so let's make it stand out here. It's going to be x divided by y. Alright, now the difference of x and 5, difference means we're going to subtract. The easiest way to do that is just going to say x minus 5, just like that. That works for me. Now, if it had said x less than 5, you would have had to change the order around. Less than means you're going to have to take the first part and move it to the back. We'll get to that when we get to example number 4, so be ready for that. Alright, 5 more than the product of 3 and a number. So now we're getting into a couple of different terms here. We're getting into taking a product and then adding 5 to that number. So that's where it's going to get really tricky here. So we start with the product of 3 and a number. Now that means you're going to take the number and multiply it by 3. I think the easiest way to do that is going to be to just say 3x, because x is what we use more often than not to describe a number that we don't know. Now, if you say n, or if your teacher prefers that you use n, it's all good. I'm just going to stick to x whenever I can't decide. Alright, now we have to do 5 more than that number, which means we are going to add 5 to that. Okay, so that's how it needs to look here. Now, we're going to try something similar on example number 4. So we're going to do the quotient of 3 and a number. Now this is usually easier to just write out myself, so I'm going to just write it out. And I'm going to say the quotient of 3 and a number. So instead of 3 times x, it's going to be 3 divided by x. And then I'm going to want 5 less than that, which means I'm going to take that current amount and I'm going to subtract 5 from it. So it's going to look something like that. Okay, so that's how I would do it personally if it were me. Make sure when you read that less than, that's the one that most people get wrong. I shouldn't say most people, but that is the most common mistake that I personally see, is that they try to they try to write it without switching the order up. You have to make sure that that 5 goes at the end. Alright, let's try to write a word phrase using the expression here. So this looks very similar to what we did on example number 3. So I'm going to steal the language from example number 3 and try to do the best I can to copy it over. So I'm going to say this is going to be 2 more than the product of 7. And in this case, I don't have to say a number because I already chose x. So I'm just going to write it like that instead. That's my preference. Again, when you're choosing word phrases, there are oftentimes going to be multiple correct answers, and you have to just sort of write it the best you can. Again, building on that, if you were to write on example number 6, x divided by 6, you'd be right. There's nothing wrong with that statement. I try to expand my vocabulary a little bit, and whenever you divide to one thing by another thing, you've created a quotient. So I prefer to use that word whenever possible. And I would probably just say the quotient of x and 6. I think that's my personal preference, but again, there's not really any wrong answer. Alright, now, this is a really tricky one because we have an x minus 4 and it's in parentheses. That means that 3 is going to be multiplied by the whole thing. And so we need to make sure that we group the x and the 4 together before we multiply by 3. So if we say something like the product of 3 and, we have to make sure that before we finish this out, we don't just say the product of 3 and x. We have to make sure the x and the 4 are grouped together. So we have to be really careful about how we phrase this. So I'm going to go with the product of 3 and the difference of x and 4. So now you know that you're taking the number 3 and you're multiplying it not by x, not by 4, but the difference of x and 4. So that's a really tricky one here. All right, for example number 8, this one can be really tricky because you have to group the x and the 3 together before you divide it by 5. I would like to write it like we did on example number 7, but that's going to get really wordy here. And it would be tough to read when it was all said and done, because what you would find is it would say the quotient of the sum of x and 3 and 5, and that doesn't really explain what's going on. So I think the best way to do this, in my personal opinion, would be to start with the sum and explain this as the sum of x and 3 divided by 5. So again, there are going to be different preferences with teachers, and I get that, but we need to also be focusing on making things as easy to read as possible as well. So that's what I'm going to go with. That way we know we're taking the sum of x and 3 and then we are dividing it by 5. I think that makes the most sense. All right, last two. You paid $5 per ball and the shipping was $10. So let's say you're buying 8 basketballs for your PE class or something like that. So you would have to pay $5 per ball, and then you would have to add the $10 shipping at the end. So I think the best way to describe this one would be $5 per ball. So I'm going to say 5B. And again, variable choice doesn't necessarily matter, but if you can build it on the language that was already in the problem, it usually helps. So $5 per ball, and then you're going to have to pay $10 for the shipping, so I'm going to add 10 to the end. Okay, and we'll do that same model for the last example. It's going to cost $40 per person to play. So let's say you're joining a softball league, and every person has to pay $40. So let's say your team has 12 players on it, so 40 times 12, but you have a coupon for $20 off the total. So that means when you're done paying, you could take $20 off of that. So now we're going to be dealing with subtraction. So I'm going to say $40 per person, but then you can take $20 off the total. So again, you take the number of people that are playing, you multiply it by 40, and then you take $20 off, so that means you subtract 20. So I hope that helps you get started here. Good luck the rest of the way.